Good morning, everyone, and welcome wherever you are.
I think we're just waiting before we kick off. We've got participants joining as we speak.
Oh, okay. Tell me when.
Just give a minute or two usually,
Yeah.
and then everybody will be online. How's the weather?
It's a beautiful day here. Blue sky, warm weather, perfect for Sydney. But then it's always like that here.
It's kind of like LA, yeah.
Yeah.
Like LA was. In Texas today, it was like foggy and wet. So. And then it got hot. And that's about it. In Texas, we have a saying: if you don't like the weather, wait 20 minutes. Especially in the fall and the spring. It's wild.
We've got a few more people joining, so we'll just give it another minute. Okay, well, I might kick off. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ronnie Millard, and I'm the Sales and Marketing Director here at Nirovision. We're here today to discuss the elephant in the room in many of our conversations that we've been having with clients, which is privacy. It's no secret that facial recognition technology has been subject to public backlash over the last few years in Australia, especially as everyday people become more and more concerned about companies monitoring them and capturing their data, whether through e-health apps, online shopping, or using social media. Using facial recognition and temperature screening or entering your details when you log in as a visitor to some location is another facet of that. However, given the times we live in and the pressures businesses face in the COVID era, we believe there needs to be a coming together of advanced security that is also compliant and as non-invasive as possible, while still providing the best protection for employees and their workplaces. As a software company that works with multiple partners, be they distributors, integrators, VMS solutions, or end users, here at Nirovision, we believe in bringing out the proverbial elephant in the room and facing her head on. Today, we will discuss privacy in this COVID era and what we are responsible for as businesses, as well as providing guidance to our partners who are dealing with end users on how to start the privacy conversation. To run with this discussion, we have Shah Rusiti, partner at Tees Hodgson and Ward, to discuss privacy law, and Tony Luce, marketing and business development director at Network Optics, speaking on the technology approach companies like Nirovision and NX take to make facial recognition systems as secure as possible. After the webinar, we will be sending you all a copy of our latest guide, hot off the press, the key steps to having the privacy conversation, so keep an eye out on your inbox. We will be taking questions during the webinar, so please write any questions you have in the chat box, and they will be brought to the attention of the speakers. I'll hand over now to the gentlemen, and thank you, Shah and Tony, for joining us today. Tony, especially all the way from Texas, and thanks to our audience who have made time in their day to be with us today.
Thanks, Ronnie. We appreciate that. And it's great to be here to have the opportunity to talk about privacy and how Privacy Act and other privacy provisions interact with what's now happening as a growing important feature of technology through the use of automatic facial recognition systems. I'd like to start, I think, though, by just taking us back a bit. A lot of people are concerned about the use of technology these days, but you have to remember that the use of biometric data goes back a very long way. I mean, as far back as the 1960s, the FBI was already using fingerprint recognition as a way of identifying people. So there's nothing new about the concept of getting biometric data and using that for identification purposes. Rather, it's the fast development, I think, of the technology that has raised some concerns. From my viewpoint as a lawyer doing commercial work and looking at privacy in particular, there really isn't that great a need for that sort of insecurity or concern if appropriate steps are taken to manage this type of technology and sensitive information in the way that businesses have been doing for quite some time. It's really more a question, I think, of making people comfortable that the technology will be properly used. So automatic facial recognition technology, AFRT, is something that, as I say, started in its origins with fingerprints and palm prints, voice recording, and so on, and is now just really developed organically to facial structure, the shape of the face, the distance between the eyes, the size of the jaw, those sorts of elements there, which can be used. So we'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but I think one of the things I was wondering about was whether people listening, watching today have actually used any form of biometric scanning in their own workplaces, and how that's gone, or whether you're actually considering implementing that at the moment. We will have a series of polls during the presentation, and this is the first one, about whether you are using it or you're thinking about using it. So it would be great if you could give us some feedback as we're proceeding on that.
Shaw, one thing I would add was just a lot of the concern now, I think, is stemming from the fact that in the past, biometrics were really limited to really high security areas, and they were generally what was called standalone units, whereas in the data itself would be stored on the technology on a device, and then the information that was shared with a security system would be like, yes, this person was verified or not, right? And nowadays, it's more about the scale and the prevalence in terms of like facial recognition technology and biometric recognition technology is everywhere. It's on your phones, right? It's in your computer, sign in on Windows, facial recognition. So, and then it's also used in just apps, you know, fun apps where you're adding, you know, overlays to your face and everything like that. So the thing I think that makes a lot of people nervous is just the amount of your personal data that's out there right now, right? And just one thing to add for the kind of historical aspect. I mean, yeah, fingerprints have been used for the longest period of time in access control. Voice recognition started off with a lot of customer service online stuff. And then where we're at now is neural networks and AI have really allowed us to apply the biometric technology to video via a stream of images, right? And so, I mean, that's where we're at today, and the prevalence, I think, is what's really driving a lot of the concern of it. So, yeah,
but it's an interesting juxtaposition. On the one hand, consumers are obviously worried about preserving and protecting their private information, their privacy, and what's happening with their data. On the other hand, they freely give it away on Facebook, on Google, on groups that they get involved in. Just using their iPhones with really no thought about where that data is going or being stored. So I think part of the discussion needs to be definitely around the security and safety of that data, but also explaining the need for the collection of the information. Because I think if people understand it's being collected for a limited purpose, that it's being properly stored and handled, that it's safe and secure, that will go a long way to dealing with their fears in using the technology. The reality is that banks, for example, have been using a variety of technology for years, and some of the banks have made some mistakes in their data storage and have had to fix them. But like any technology, these technologies do improve, and they improve incrementally. They improve when significant issues arise and are addressed. So, for example, if there's a change in privacy laws that imposes new conditions, most of the providers are able to adapt to that and ensure that they're compliant, so that consumers really are in a position where they can have a level of comfort about what's being done in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say something to that point, but Yeah, we're here to talk about how you can consider these this regulation. Basically, I think in every time you have these situations where technology brings with it huge benefits, but also potential risks, you have a period of adjustment where the technology kind of outreaches the law or surpasses what the law has already got in place in terms of regulations. And then you get this kind of pullback once it becomes a big enough concern where regulators step in and say, okay, now let's look at how this data is used and or how this technology is being used in ways that we can protect consumers and protect people from the potential negative impact. So there's always a trade-off between, what the benefits are and then what the downsides are, right? And the interconnectedness of the world right now is where most of the concern is coming out in terms of like freely giving away your data. Like you said, a lot of people just don't realize that when you're using these apps on your phone where you're doing overlays, they're also collecting your personal data because you are the product, right? Yeah. But in the security world, it's a fundamentally different approach to this. In terms of these systems are generally not connected to each other. That data is stored locally. And these are the different things that you need to consider when you're implementing them in your workplaces, right?
And that's it. I mean, I think people are familiar with the fact that they're giving information. Some people have a greater concern about what's done with it and where it's stored than others. But the reality is our technology keeps incorporating more and more of it. And as I mentioned, look at the latest iPhones in terms of facial recognition being used in iPhones now. People accept it, think it's great. So really what we're about is trying to increase people's awareness to address the concerns that they have about the collection of biometric data. And that involves dealing with the regulators, typically the governments, the Privacy Commissioner here in Australia, those sorts of entities. It involves really educating consumers, which has always been the case with technology and technological risk. And it involves looking at how the privacy laws apply and how you address questions about privacy from privacy advocates, from lawyers, from users. This type of collection of information isn't going to stop, it's going to grow. So it means that we need to have the ability to regulate it adequately, but also the ability to explain it. And I think that's really important. One key area that is particularly relevant to biometric information, though here in Australia, is the issue of sensitive information. In Australia, we have a Privacy Act. It applies to all the states and territories equally, so it's countrywide. It's similar to provisions in other countries, for example, New Zealand. It distinguishes between general information and what's called sensitive information. And sensitive information includes things like your health. It includes things like your race, your religion, the sorts of things that most of us would agree is not normal information we would give out. It's something that's personal information in a deeper sense than, for example, my name, my address, my email address, my phone number, those sorts of things. So when we're looking at collecting that sort of information, biometric information in this case, we need to recognise that it falls within that category of sensitive information. And that means we've got to make an extra effort to ensure that the users understand what that means. So we need to explain what sensitive information is. We need to be able to confirm that it's covered by the Privacy Act and that providers who are collecting that information have obligations. And those obligations are, firstly, to make people aware of what they're doing, to get their consent. And I'll talk more about consent in a while. Obviously, to ensure a very high level of protection of sensitive information, because of course, when you look at all the issues that come up about the use of personal information, it's what we see in the press and what we see online is the big issues that arise when something goes terribly wrong. The reality is 90% of the cases or more, there's very few leakage of personal information or sensitive information, but the press always gets the large ones and they get highly publicised. So we need to work on ensuring that there is a high level of protection of that information, but also that the consumers, employees, if you're an employer, visitors, those people all understand why you're actually collecting the information as well. So why are we collecting it? What are we doing with it? How are we storing it? And how long are we going to keep it too? That's another thing that you need to bear in mind. They're all questions that all of us would ask generally and consumers would ask, but they're questions that as suppliers or providers we need to be able to answer. And they're not hard questions to answer if you think of it from that privacy context. My general approach is to say to people, look, what do you actually use the technology for? What do you need it for? Why are you using it? What's your business requirement here? You may want technology like this, which is hands-free. So the ability to have facial recognition software to couple that with taking someone's temperature, for example, offers an excellent example of a completely hands-free automated system. It means you don't have to worry about people using swipe cards or touching things to gain access. It's also a system, obviously, that can be used on a much broader scale. It's not just about identifying employees and visitors. That's an important part of it. But it's also something which can be either spread through the organisation, for example, to differentiate different areas of access, not just to confirm when someone clocked in or clocked out, but also through temperature checks, identifying a potential health risk. And frankly, if you can see that someone has an unusually high temperature at the point of entry, then that's probably a very good thing for the health of everybody else in that organisation or those premises at the time. It also enables venues like clubs and hotels and problem gamblers to actually implement strategies to identify those people as they come into the premises. For those that have listed themselves under a self-exclusion because they're habitual gamblers, for example, it gives the organisation the opportunity to pick that up as the person arrives and help them to reduce the risks of their problem gambling. So there's a wide range of uses that are actually really beneficial in the technology.
Another use I was going to point out for like Nirovision is like people counting and just the unique number of customers that are coming in, where you don't necessarily need to know specific personally identifying information, but you do need to be able to separate out unique individuals in order to be able to count them properly, right? Or to identify, let's say demographic information for retail analytics. The same kind of technology can be used for all those use cases.
That's very true. And then it comes down to analysing just what the information you want is, why. And there are some simple steps to that. I mean, firstly, work out what it is you're trying to do. So in your example, for example, it may be purely for analytics and you want to eliminate duplication of the same person there. In the employee sphere, it may be to have a better hands-free system for access to premises, a better way of monitoring access by people who don't work there. You can work out what your need is, that's fine, but you really need to be conscious of the fact that you shouldn't go overboard as a business in trying to cover every possible possibility. You should keep what you do to a minimum so that you can be clear to the individuals, to the consumers, to the staff, what information you're collecting, why you're collecting it. It also makes it easier to comply with the privacy laws if you actually understand what you can and can't do, and focus on what you really need to do. That focus on what you need to do will help organisations comply with privacy, because they're not going out beyond what's a legitimate reason to collect the information in the first place. And the next point I make is that most organisations have comprehensive privacy policies that apply to staff, that apply to visitors, third parties, but it's worth looking at those privacy policies and statements to see whether they actually include the use of this kind of technology, and if not, to adjust those policies to take that type of technology into account. And then finally, the point I make here is, look, once you've done all of that and you think you've got it right, go back and just test it against what the Privacy Act actually says. So, as I was saying, look, privacy compliance is something that's essential for all businesses today. We've got in Australia the Privacy Act, the privacy principles. They're very clearly laid out. They're very defined rules. The bottom line is organisations have to comply with those rules. They have to comply when they're collecting the information at the first point. They have to comply when they're using it, and they have to comply when they're storing the information. So you have to have a reason for collecting the information. You have to have a reason for using it. And if you're going to collect it, you have to have good, robust systems in place for storing the information and making sure that it won't be improperly used or disclosed. Sensitive information is something that's a special subclass, and it's of particular concern. Sensitive information includes, as I mentioned, things like medical information, race, religion. There's a list of those things which are sensitive and we need to be concerned about. The main privacy concerns generally, though, are those base ones that are we getting consent for the particular use that we're making? Organisations need to be familiar with their own privacy policies and their own obligations, and check them if you're going to use technology to make sure that your privacy policies or privacy terms and conditions, your employment contracts, address those issues. And I'm wondering, how many people listening today are familiar with their own company's privacy policies and obligations? When was the last time you read your company's privacy policy to see what it actually says? I'd certainly encourage people to go back and look at their privacy policies, and if you've got a dedicated privacy team, to talk to them and say, well, what are we doing about this? If we want to introduce technology, what are the issues we've got to cover and how do we do that? Because I think there's plenty of scope to use this as an opportunity to improve your systems and improve your handling of personal information. Things that we need to consider are how we get consent. For things like facial recognition technology, where you're using biometrics, so that the image of someone's face, their features, etc., those biometrics need consent. But that consent really needs to be informed consent. So we go back to that issue of explaining to consumers, explaining to groups, staff, etc., visitors, why we're collecting the information and what we do with it. So the purpose we're collecting it for, who do we share it with? Look, usually it's going to be no one other than the organisation, except that we might have a third-party host provider who has a very secure host facility, host for a lot of other companies, and we store it off-site, and it could be because off-site storage is a good second backup in case things go wrong in your office, which is perfectly legitimate. One question people do ask me often is, well, how long can we store it for? And the answer is really easy in one sense. It's as long as you need. But, well, what does that mean? So in the case of a company with employees, for example, you can keep that information as long as the employee is employed, but you can also keep it after that because you're entitled to keep employee records. In terms of sensitive information, really it should only be kept for as long as it's needed. Facial recognition, for example, you're using it to identify a person, and it may be that that sort of data can be deleted every few weeks on the basis that you'll capture new data at another time. You may have another reason for keeping it longer, but the clear point here is work out what you actually need and how long you need to keep the information for. If you are collecting images, leaving aside the question of staff, for example, you shouldn't be retaining them without a reason to keep them. So moving on, if I may, to drilling down into the Privacy Act. The very first principle in the Privacy Act is that you have to be open and transparent about the way you manage personal information. The principles say you have to take reasonable steps to implement practices, procedures, systems that ensure you comply with the APP. So as I said, managing the information in an open and transparent way, telling people why you're collecting it and what you're going to do with it and how it's going to be stored. Having and express an up-to-date privacy policy that covers those sorts of things. What happens if they want to know what information you have relating to them? You should be prepared to be able to provide that information to them. All of that helps people become comfortable with the use of the technology. So that openness, that transparency, some might say it's a bit bothersome, but it really helps you if you're trying to explain why you're collecting that kind of information in the way that you are. If you are collecting personal information, you need to comply in Australia with those privacy principles. You have to have a process in place, people in place who deal with privacy inquiries and privacy complaints. Privacy complaints need to be addressed quickly because they can dramatically escalate if you ignore them. We have a privacy commissioner here and individuals are entitled to take their complaints to the privacy commissioner. You really don't want to develop a history of claims made to the privacy commissioner. The better way to deal with it is to have practices and procedures in place that enable you to effectively deal with those sorts of complaints or inquiries when they arise. So taking proactive steps internally is one of the essential features to ensure compliance. And what sort of steps? Well, you're only required generally to take reasonable steps. Reasonable steps to ensure that there's no misuse or interference or loss or unauthorised disclosure or access in particular. Reasonable steps is good for the general category, but you need to bear in mind that you have to be particularly careful about sensitive personal information. Mostly this means data storage, firstly, having secure, robust facilities for data storage. Secondly, it means access restrictions to ensure that there's no unauthorised access. Within an organisation, if you've got people that can access that, have you analysed why they need to access it, whether it can be dealt with without accessing, what their rights and privileges are, and how do you ensure compliance? It's really important when you're dealing with the information of customers, but also with employees within an organisation, to be able to develop a level of trust and confidence by being able to answer questions like, what steps are you taking to protect my personal information? So far as collecting information is concerned, other than sensitive information, you can only collect it or ask for the information if it's actually directly related to your functions or activities. So you can't just collect it because you're interested in knowing and you might use it for a different purpose. That means you have to be fairly clear in what you're asking for and why, and there has to be a connection between that and the function or the activity that's necessary, reasonably necessary for what you're doing. So the simple takeaway from this point is really easy. Don't collect more than you actually need. That's not that hard. In practice, personal information is treated as information which is collected by you, and you shouldn't collect more, as I say, than you require. So if you're collecting personal information on a daily basis, you then have to think, well, do we keep it? Do we not keep it? A good example is someone gives you a business card. You might look at that and think, good, well, yeah, fine, I'm never going to talk to that person again. You toss the card. You might think, well, that's actually quite useful. They'll make a good contact. You put them into your database. You have a reason for collecting that information. If ultimately you don't use it, then you can discard it. If someone sends in a job application or comes in for a job interview, or if you've got a customer who sends a complaint letter, you'll be collecting information about that job applicant or that customer. You'll need to keep that information in the context of what you're doing. Do we hire this person or not? If not, we send a rejection letter. If someone makes a complaint, we need to investigate the complaint. We need to be able to respond to the complaint. To investigate it, I may need to look at personal information I've collected. What was their interaction with our organisation? What was the transaction that caused them to complain? So there are legitimate reasons to be collecting information which goes beyond maybe just the bounds of the specific issue. So someone makes an inquiry on your website. You're collecting information when you get their email address, when you get their name, their contact details, etc. What do you do with the information if they don't come back, if nothing happens? Do you have a process for just automatically deleting old data that hasn't been acted on?
Good news, I was going to say on that point, just from a security and IP video surveillance standpoint, is generally people have a set duration that they want to keep video and its associated metadata. And the way that our system works is you define that, and when the way that we've implemented metadata collection and event data that's related to video is the moment that the video itself is either overwritten or disappears for some reason, and that same metadata and the associated information along with it's going to disappear as well, right? So if you've set a policy of 30 days for keeping the video, then that metadata itself is most likely going to disappear at 30 days unless you've got a specific reason that you want to keep it for longer, right? And to your point earlier, don't collect too much information, right? This goes back to just straight up system design. You know, we're as integrators and as technology providers, we have to start having the conversation at the beginning of the project in terms of what you want to do with your data, and include that sort of privacy plan with the information that's being stored, and kind of outline for your customers how the system works, how long the data is going to be kept for, and ways that you can kind of keep it secure. But also in your design, don't design to implement face recognition on every single camera in a facility if you only really needed it at 2 points, right? You know, don't create a problem. Don't generate a problem by giving your customers too much capability when they don't really need it. So, yeah.
And you've made a really good point, Tony, and that is that you do have the ability to determine how long you want to keep that information for. And if you want to say, well, look, we really only need it for 2 weeks, and we'll have it automatically deleted every 2 weeks, that's fine. If you need it for a month and you think that's an appropriate period, the same thing. And the good point about that, the positive point is, in terms of consumer inquiries, you can have a really simple answer. How long do we keep information for? We only keep this for 2 weeks, it rolls over and gets deleted. If that's the case and that works for the business, then that provides a high level of comfort, I think, to people about what's happening with their information. Sensitive information is in a basket of its own. You can only collect sensitive information if it's reasonably necessary for one of your functions or activities. So it's quite a narrow range. Sensitive information, as I've mentioned, things like race, religion, those sorts of things, is a specific topic of its own in the privacy principles here. Probably the area where it is of most concern is in relation to health information. We've got a poll question, I think, that you can see about, do you know what sensitive personal information is? Is it something you've looked at particularly, as opposed to just generally, well, it's personal information of some kind? It'd be useful to know how many people have drilled down a bit more into sensitive information and what that really means.
Hey, Shaw, I have a question for you, because it's a term that you've used many times, and I'm wondering what the definition is, if there is a definition, which is a reasonably, right, or reasonable.
Yeah.
As a lawyer, like, what does that mean to you if you're going to go argue that? I guess is a question for you. It's probably a big question, right? But just quick answer to that.
Yeah. So Tony, at the end of the day, look, I can give you the lawyer's answer, which is reasonable is an objective test, but that's not really going to help you answer the question. The reality is you've got to make a serious assessment about, why am I collecting this information? What do I need it for? How long do I need to keep it? And what are the consequences of keeping it or not keeping it? And if you go through those steps, then you'll get to a point where you say, well, you know, I need to collect it and keep it for X period of time because something might happen. I'll give you an example in the legal profession. We do wills for people, and they sign their wills. They often leave the original in our safe custody, which is a locked vault, fireproof room, all those sorts of things. You go into that room and you can find a will that's 80 or 90 years old because someone made it all those years ago and then maybe years later went to a different lawyer. Now, technically, we've collected and held that personal information for 80 years. I don't expect that person to come back, but they might. But what I do is I make sure that it is securely stored and that the access is limited. So the first thing you can do when you're talking about collecting information is consider, well, if we're going to collect it, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to store it? And how do we ensure that it's secure? If you use that as the rationale, and then you say, well, okay, there's a lot of effort in doing all of that. So do I really need to collect this information? And the answer is simple. You don't collect sensitive personal information if you don't need it.
Would documenting, like the questions that you just brought up, right? Would sitting down with your customer and really documenting the answer to those questions at the beginning of the project, like really help you from a, let's say you did enter it, you got in a situation where there is a legal aspect to it, that documentation that you put together for the customer where you went through and outlined all those questions and you wrote them down and you wrote down the answers. I mean, that would be something that would be useful in responding to a situation like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if you've taken steps to work out what's a reasonable period of time to keep the information, for example, and you've done that based on some good logic, then that's quite an appropriate thing to do. You may say that in certain cases, you know, we need to keep this for 6 years in case we get sued, for example. Or you may say, well, once we get this, once we've delivered the service and the task that the contract has come to an end, we don't need it anymore. We don't need to keep that information. So you can have a very pragmatic approach to working out what information you should keep and how long you keep it, depending on whether you think there are consequences in the future that might need to be addressed or whether it's a one-off. You know, that customer comes in, that customer goes, we never see them again. We don't need to collect that information for the next, or keep it for the next 10 years. With sensitive information, probably the simplest answer to dealing with sensitive information is this: don't collect it if you don't have to. And that means don't collect information about race, health, or those sorts of things if you don't have to. However, that said, you are still allowed to collect sensitive information if you've got a legitimate purpose. And if you get the consent of the individual. There are only limited circumstances in which you can collect sensitive personal information without consent, and that's if it's impracticable to do so, or if someone's injured in a life-threatening position, their health and safety is at risk, etc. So the medical profession, for example. Where is it impractical to obtain consent? Well, there may be circumstances where you need particular information about an individual, which could be health elements, it could be the sex of that male or female, it could be geographic location, it could be a whole range of things, in order to answer the question and provide the service to that individual. So you look at whether you need to collect. If it's sensitive information, you get consent in a number of different ways. You can collect personal information in Australia only if you actually use what are called lawful and fair means. In other words, you can't collect it without a person's knowledge. You shouldn't be collecting information to use for purposes that are well away from or outside what you said you were going to do with the information. And generally the rule is you collect it directly from the information, the individual. So whether that's them using software and technology in your office or in your premises, whether that's in them coming onto the website and providing that information, you're collecting it directly from them. And what that also means is that you should try to avoid simply borrowing or having access to personal information, particularly sensitive information, that somebody else has collected, because the fact that another organisation has it doesn't mean that you can use it. If you want to collect and use that information, you really ought to be going back to the individual or the customer, because if it's sensitive information, you have to be dealing with that individual directly, unless those life-threatening or other options apply. So there are restrictions around that. And they're quite practical, quite simple restrictions to comply with, as long as you step back and just work out what your privacy obligations are. Turning to another point, all organisations obviously have privacy policies. They should be, though, simple to read. They should be in plain English, they should be in simple language and explain exactly why you collect information, how you handle the information, how you store it, when you destroy it, if that's the case, and so on. It should be a very clear statement that effectively sets out how you're complying with your privacy obligations. And we've got the statutory regime in the Privacy Act and the principles. So that means giving people access to a privacy policy, but not some long-winded 20-page document by a team of lawyers, although most of them, I have to say, are drafted by lawyers. Put it in plain English. Make sure it's understandable to people who are not lawyers. And that's really a big part of our job, is not dumbing it down, that's wrong, but making it clear and understandable to people who wouldn't normally have to engage in this sort of specific topic. So you want something that explains what information you're collecting about the person. So here, if we're looking at biometric data, facial recognition, well, we're collecting a photo. We're collecting digital information about you generated by that photo. So why do we want that? Well, because it assists us in giving you access to the premises. It assists us in confirming who's here and who's not. It assists us, for example, if there is an incident, if there is a COVID outbreak, and through the use of that technology, we can inform everyone who was there at the time. That's a terrific advantage to us, and that's a legitimate purpose for collecting. We all go to cafes or restaurants now and find that we have to scan barcodes to get in. We all give our names, we give our email addresses, we give our phone numbers, because for the moment during COVID, there's a really legitimate reason to collect. But when it comes to storage of the data, how long do you keep that for? For those cafes and restaurants, generally they're outsourcing to a third-party provider. I haven't seen one consumer while I wait in the queue to get into my cafe asking the person at the front desk, can you tell me who actually stores my personal information when I give it to you and how long you're storing it for? No, because consumers don't think of consumer activities as being that relevant. But if they come into me as a lawyer and I'm asking them for their date of birth, whether they're married, whether they've got any criminal history or this, that, they're going to start saying, well, why do you want this information? So you need to be aware that it's not just about what I can get consumers to do at a simple level, but it's thinking about why you need to collect the information. How are we going to safeguard it and what do we use it for? And being in a position to answer that question. If people ask you, well, why do you need it? Why do you need this particular information? It's really good if your internal policies and procedures enable people to answer those questions comfortably. It's also really good if individuals know or can find out really easily how they get access to see what you've got, to know what you've got, and if there's a problem with it, to lodge a complaint. So privacy compliance takes time, takes effort, takes resources, but it's really not hard if you drill down into these obligations. Informed consent means if you make the individual aware of the consequences of giving or not giving your consent at the time. Really simple, okay? In order to use this service, we require this information from you. You don't have to give it, but if you don't give it, we may not be able to provide that particular service to you. So that's an explanation. Explain then, if we do collect your information, this is how we handle it, and this is how we protect your information. Communicate the request in plain English if it's an English-speaking country, and do this honestly without that legal or industry jargon. You've got to make it consumer-friendly, and that works best because it means that you're more confident that that consent will be a voluntary consent, because you've explained the options available, you've explained the consequences if the person refuses to consent, such as, sorry, I can't let you in the premises unless I get that information from you. Or you can explain that we can't provide the services if we're restricted in what we do in that sense. So, for example, you give us information, look, we will need to be able to store that information. You know, our privacy policy says that we store it with a reputable storage organisation. If someone says, I don't want it stored anywhere, then you may say, we may not be able to give you the services if we can't store the information. I keep coming back to this point, but it's a really, really important one. What you have to be able to explain to people why you need their consent to collect their information. What do you need the information for? And be as specific as you possibly can. Don't ask for more than you really need. So focus on that within your business. And focus on not only what you need, but who you're sharing with and why. And if you're going to be sharing it, put that into your privacy policy. Make sure that people are aware that their information can be shared. That's one of the big differences between businesses with privacy policies and privacy regulations and things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, which have their own internal policies. And yes, you can read their privacy policies if you can find them. But consumers are providing a huge amount of their personal information across a range of forums that have absolutely no control over the accuracy, the security, and the use of that personal information. So honestly, if you're looking at it from a consumer's perspective, you could say, well, why are you so concerned about what I do with your information when you're giving it to the rest of the world? Now, that's not the right answer from a business perspective, but it does indicate that as a business, you're actually kept at a higher standard of obligation than a lot of other organisations who just allow individuals to upload their personal information really without thinking about their privacy. So the standard is higher for us in business when we're collecting that information. So we do need to use plain English. We do need to explain why we're obtaining the information and for what purposes. We do need to have these policies. We need to bear in mind that individuals don't often ask the questions, so we have to be positive in telling them, look, there's our privacy policy, have a look at it, you'll see that we only use your information for these purposes. And one final point on this slide is about informed consent. Well, sorry, but children can't give informed consent. Someone with a mental incapacity can't give informed consent. That doesn't stop a whole lot of children using Facebook, Twitter, or all the other programs there and giving away lots of personal information, with the only control mechanism being their parents. A, if the parents actually know how to log in and see it, or B, if they've had the discussions with their children about the risks of giving you personal information. And if you wanted to look at one area of privacy that hasn't been successful, it's actually dealing with the general ability for anyone to access anything and give their personal information on a whole range of web-based sites. And again, Facebook's a good example of that. Parents, if they're not giving some guidance to children, are creating a much greater risk for those children than organisations who say, look, sorry, this is our privacy policy and this is how it works.
So I did have one question for the privacy policy, like the need to get consent.
Yeah.
If you don't have their name, right?
Yeah.
But let's say you collect others, what's typically considered sensitive information when it's paired with a name, does the policy still apply?
Yeah, so firstly, you do have to have a policy about collecting sensitive information and be prepared to say that we will collect that information. So far as aggregating it with other information, if you're going to collect, for example, biometric data, you need to be able to explain what you're using it for. And so if you're combining different pieces of information that the same customer or individual gives you at different times, you may be building up a picture which goes beyond what you'd originally explained. So if that's the case, you have to think about that and say, well, to get informed consent, I need to explain a bit more about what I'm going to use and do with this data. So we'll be collecting, if you agree to this, we're collecting this biometric information. We may already have information about who you are. So a good example is, I go into a club, I have to sign in when I go in. They've got information about my name. They may have other information. They might have details of my driver's license, for example, or they might have credit card information that's stored separately. Having gone in there, I then log in. I give them consent to collect more information about me that might be sensitive information, information about my health. They then use a biometric system that collects more information. So in a sense, there's nothing wrong with you linking together different bits of information that you have about an individual. But the thing you need to do is ensure that firstly, you're still storing it securely. And secondly, you can only use the information for the purpose for which it's given. If you take all of that information and you use it to build a comprehensive picture of the individual, their habits, their needs, their likes and dislikes, and you've done that without the consent for collecting and conglomerating all that information, then you've got a problem.
I guess my question though is, like, let's say I create a system where I'm collecting lots of metadata about a person, right? I know their unique ID, but I don't know their name, right? I can tell their race and their gender and their age and a bunch of other stuff from my awesome neural networking system, right? But I don't necessarily have that final piece, which is the personally identifying information. In that situation, right, do you still require informed consent?
That's a really good question, Tony. It's obviously difficult to get informed consent if you can't get it from the person who provides it. However, it is possible to collect de-identified data.
Yeah.
So if what you have is in fact a collection of de-identified data, which as a group of information you put together doesn't actually identify the individual, then I don't think you're breaching any privacy obligation in the sense that you have nothing which identifies the specific individual. It's a bit
right.
like I'm doing a survey collecting statistics.
Right.
I don't need to know who you are. I don't need any personal information about your life, your age, or anything like that. The information I'm collecting is just these statistics because I'm doing a poll or a survey. That statistical information, while it comes from the individual, and you might want to get their consent to collect the information, won't necessarily mean that you've collected private information which is automatically subject to the Privacy Act.
So you just want to have a firewall, basically, if you're in that type of situation where you want to make sure that your personal name and your things that personally identify you are firewalled off from that additional data that I'm collecting as like a data sample, basically what you were talking about. I may have a unique identifier and I can collect all this data about you, but I have to make sure that it's anonymized so that someone's not going to be able to come in and connect it back to you as an individual.
Yeah, and so there is an overlap there. Normally, to collect the information in the first place, you should be obtaining their consent. But that can be consent that's done without identifying the individual. Now, a good example of that would be if you're using facial recognition technology and you collect information about an individual, which is an identifier, which would be the facial characteristics, but you know nothing else about them. And you can't connect that image with anything else. You've still collected sensitive information.
Still got their biometrics, right?
Yeah. You've collected that biometrics. You're supposed to get consent under the Privacy Act because that's sensitive information, which you can do relatively simply. But beyond that, you don't know who they are. You don't know anything more about them other than that you've got that biometric information. You would treat that as sensitive information. But it's not something you're going to then agglomerate with a whole lot of information for the purposes of building up a profile of the individual and finding out who they are. So you've de-identified the information to a significant degree at the point of collection by not linking it to their name. So that's a safe way or a safer way if you're collecting biometric data to reduce the risk. And part of this is not just about compliance with the Privacy Act, it's also about reducing the risk of data loss or data theft and the implications of that. Because as we've seen with Cambridge Analytica and with other large organisations, when data is hacked and information goes out, it's a lot of information about individuals. So what we're trying to do is say, well, look, just collect what's necessary for us, keep it to a minimum so that we minimise our risk. And you should look at it as a risk management strategy. If you don't need to know who the person is in order to fulfil the function, so for example, in order to give someone entry to premises who's a visitor, someone going into a club and they scan in, if you don't need to collect their name and address and details, but just the fact that there was an individual on that day at that time who came in or who had these biometric features, without identifying them, you have a reason to collect it because you're monitoring who comes in.
Makes sense. There was a question that came in, which is a unique kind of situation, but it's interesting, which is, you know, we're talking about purposeful collection of data, right?
Yeah.
But what happens in a situation where you have, let's say, guards who are wearing body cams, and an incident occurs and they activate their body cam and they end up capturing not only the target of what they're doing, but other people kind of in the situation as well, without prior consent. How can you use that information, or how do you address that type of situation?
Well, I suppose that goes very much to the circumstances. I mean, underlying that, you've got a particularly important element, which is maintaining security and safety, whether it's in a workplace, whether it's outside a building where there's a protest going on. You know, there is a legitimate reason to collect information for the purposes of security, where there's a real and reasonable apprehension that someone may be injured, for example, in a protest, or where you suspect there has been some criminal activity. And frankly, we've been doing that for years with security cameras. Security cameras are everywhere, and that's what they do. They're the first source that, you know, after talking to people, the police go to. They find out what's on the security footage. So the mere fact that you collect that information in that context doesn't mean that you're doing something that is that different. It's the question of what you do with it once you've collected it.
Yeah. I think historically, I would say, like, you know, having been working in this IP video and video surveillance for a while, it's actually surprising to me, in a good way, how few incidents there are with people sharing video that may be compromising, or, you know, like that they shouldn't necessarily share. Yeah. And I think it points to the idea that most of these systems are local, most of them are very secure, most of them are managed by a few key people that really have access to that platform, whereas everybody else is not privy to that data. And that's important. I think you touched on it earlier, making sure you only give access to the system to people who actually are going to be utilizing the data in the correct way, or the appropriate way. So.
Yeah, and that's it. And you see the contrast between people who go out in the streets and take video footage of themselves, people around them, whether it's, you know, because they're protesting or because they're having a party. Most of those people have absolutely no concern about where all that footage goes. Indeed, the first thing they do is post it somewhere online. You know, as an organisation, well, you know, you just say, well, it's entirely up to each individual to decide what information they're going to allow to be collected in that way. But from an organisation's point of view, you always come back to the principle is we keep it as little as we need to, we keep it only for so long as we need it, and we only use it for legitimate purposes. And it's not that hard, even though we're collecting sensitive information in terms of biometric data, it's not that hard to follow those principles. So I want to just focus briefly, as we're coming to the close here, about employees. This is a slightly different area because employment involves employment contracts, terms and conditions, and it involves looking at the employment contracts to confirm that employers are actually allowed to collect and use personal information. General personal information is by default collectible. So someone's name, address, contact details, perhaps age, that sort of information is a no-brainer. When you get to sensitive personal information, such as health issues, for example, that's a different thing. You have to have a legitimate reason to collect that type of sensitive information. It could be, for example, in the middle of COVID, that you want to make sure that none of your employees coming in has symptoms of COVID. You can ask them when they last went and got a test. You can take their temperature. All of those things are legitimate things to do because you're looking at the safety and health of all of the employees and visitors there. However, when it comes down to things like biometric data in particular, you do need to, even for employees, get consent. Now, for visitors, customers, people going into a club, it can be a sign out the front which says, you know, if you come in here, you're consenting to us taking photos of you and recording information about you. In an employment context, you can do the same. You can have a policy which says, look, you know, if you're coming in, we'll have some particular personal information we collect. The trick here is biometric data falls into that category of sensitive information. So it's not like just ordinary details of name, address, telephone, etc. It's sensitive personal information. And you can't collect sensitive personal information without consent. So the starting point for that, if you're going to do that, is to ensure that you obtain consent. There are two ways you can do that. You can have terms in your employment contracts which confirms that, yes, you will be collecting personal information, and that can include sensitive information. That's step one. Update your employment terms and conditions, your employment contracts, to say that the employee consents to the collection of that information. Great. Step two, you've got employees that have been there for some time. Their contracts don't say anything about collecting sensitive information. There's no consent given. What do I do now? Ask them for consent is the answer. Say, look, we're introducing this technology because it means we can ensure the safety of our employees, ensure the safety of our visitors. It means that we can have a better, more efficient system of identifying people coming and going. It also means that in the event that there's an incident, we're able to quickly find who it was that came in where and quickly advise them that there may be an issue. If we couple that with temperature scanning, for example, we may be able to identify people who have a higher than normal temperature and therefore speak to them before a risk develops. In terms of a way of initial screening to ensure that you reduce the risks of COVID coming into a workplace, a temperature check is pretty standard. I have to say I go to a great gym every second morning, and the first thing they do when I clock in is a temperature scan. They do that for every single person that walks through the door. Using facial recognition technology coupled with a temperature check isn't that novel. They're doing two things. One of them is checking the identity of the person or confirming their identity. The second is a health-related purpose, which is checking to see whether they have a high temperature. But you have to be able to ensure that employees understand that. We're running out of time a little, but the summary I give is this, that from an employee perspective, explain why you're introducing the technology. Explain how long you'll keep the data and when it'll be destroyed. Look, you know, it rotates through every, week, month period. We don't keep it for longer than we need it. How secure is the data storage? That's a really important question to be able to answer. What rights do they have? The Privacy Act says they've got a right to know what personal information you have. So what are their rights? And who are you going to give it to? Generally, for personal information which is sensitive, you're not going to give it to anyone outside of the organisation, or to the extent that your data is hosted somewhere else, to the host server who signed a contract that says they'll comply. So there are really simple policies and procedures you can implement. One case that's come up recently, last year here in Australia, was about an employee whose employment contract was signed way back before they'd included consent to use technology. In that particular example, the company had a problem. And the problem was because the individual didn't want to use the scanning system when he came in. He objected to the collection of the information in that form. The alternative for that employee was to say, okay, well, we're going to make you sign in manually each day you come in. Everybody else will just walk straight in, but no, you don't want to do that. So you'll sign in manually. He was able to say, you can't collect that because you've never got consent from me. My original employment contract didn't have that consent in it. It was sensitive information, my facial features, my biometric data is sensitive. Therefore, you can only collect it if you get my consent, and I don't want to consent to you collecting it. No contract clause saying that you're entitled to collect it. So they said to him, look, you know, this is our new policy, everyone's complying, and in fact, everyone else was complying except this one particular person. If you don't, you know, you might get dismissed because that's the way it is. We're all implementing this. I must say it's not apparent unless you read the case. That particular business was one where the employees generally weren't really heavily regulated or required to confirm their identity. But what they did have a big issue with was people who were supposedly clocking in the mornings when they found out that it was somebody else on staff who was clocking in. So
I had a similar case. I did the access control system for the French consulate in Shanghai, and they had no French embassy or consulate had ever put in place an ID card, a card access control based system, because they had just a vehement opposition to the idea that you're going to track when I clock in and clock out, and you're going to know when I'm in the office and when I'm not in the office, and so they had to go back to the French government and ask for permission to put the system in that we recommended. And what we did was we provided training to the employees on, you know, how this thing works, and you know, the fact that you don't even have to be identified. They just have to issue this. It's just a unique identifier. It's like, it's a replacement for a key, guys. And they ended up adopting it. And then because of that, all the employees were really comfortable with it, and they ended up rolling out the same access control system across the world for the French government, because of the first case in Shanghai where we actually took the time to explain how this thing worked to the employees, and their objections were dropped. So education is definitely a key part of this.
Yeah, hugely so, hugely so. That one case, which is in the slides, people will see, you know, was one where they said, look, you know, you're not going to stay here if that's the view you take. But the Privacy Commission said, no, you can't do that. You can't force someone to give you sensitive information. But really what it means, as you're just saying there, Tony, look, it's really about how you communicate the message as much as anything else.
Absolutely.
Okay. I might close, and thank you, Sharon and Tony, for a fantastic discussion. I think we agree it's a conversation that we could go on for hours and hours, if not days. I think it's fair to summarise that the consumers, employees, employers of today remain vigilant about how businesses are using their personal data, and want to feel empowered in their approach into delving into the what, why, and where of it all. As a result, companies must prioritise data protection and offer nothing but full transparency to encourage reassurance, peace of mind, and therefore trust in the solutions being offered. Those solutions being offered need to ensure that there is a security and safety and not detract from it, which is, I think, a point that Shah and Tony made very passionately. To support our audiences in having the right conversations with their clients, we have two value-add pieces that we will be sending out in the next week or two. I know that we got a question about that as Shah was presenting. The first will be a guide that summarises all you've heard today, so you'll have some digestible key takeaways that you can use. And the second is a guide specifically for our system integrator partners on privacy compliance for Australian companies, to enable them to have those good and solid conversations with their end users. So we trust that this will go some way in helping to build privacy awareness in Australia. And so without further ado, I think that's a wrap from all of us. If you have any questions for Nirovision, Network, Optics, or indeed SHAR, please send us a note to hello@nirovision.com, and we'll make sure that you get answered as soon as possible. So thank you once again for taking time out of your day, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much for stuff.